From the outside, David and Maria looked like the kind of couple people envied. Neighbors often saw them walking hand in hand down the quiet suburban street, exchanging polite smiles with those they passed. Their home, a modest two-story with freshly painted shutters, radiated the warmth of domestic stability. To onlookers, theirs was a love story rooted in devotion and shared dreams. But like many carefully maintained facades, what lay beneath was far more complicated. David, at 39, carried himself with quiet confidence. He had a solid build, a professional demeanor, and the air of someone dependable. Maria, 32, was vibrant and graceful, her laughter carrying through the garden in summer evenings when friends visited. To outsiders, their differences complemented each other. His steadiness balanced her liveliness, his restraint softened by her warmth. Together, they seemed unbreakable. Yet behind closed doors, silence often filled the spaces between them. David's secret weighed heavily, a truth buried so deep it shaped the way he saw himself. Since his early 20s, after a devastating medical diagnosis, he had lived with the knowledge that he was infertile. Years of doctor visits had confirmed what a single test first revealed. He could never father a child. The diagnosis had changed the course of his life. In his 20s, relationships faltered once the subject of family arose. When he met Maria in his early 30s, he was upfront about it. She had smiled gently at the confession, her hand reaching for his, assuring him that love was more important than children. That night, he believed he had found someone who would accept all of him, scars, limitations, and truths included. For years, her words soothed him. Maria never complained about the absence of children, at least not openly. When friends shared news of pregnancies, Maria would clap with genuine enthusiasm, hugging them tightly, her eyes sparkling. But in the stillness of night, David sometimes caught her staring at the ceiling, a kind of longing etched into her expression. When he asked, she dismissed it with a smile, whispering, "I have everything I need." David clung to that reassurance, even as doubts crept into his heart. He worked long hours as an architect, pouring himself into designs, convincing himself he was building a legacy that would outlast him. Maria, meanwhile, balanced her days between a part-time job at a boutique and evenings filled with social engagements. She thrived on connection, on being seen, while David retreated further into the comfort of routine. Neighbors adored them. Mrs. Caldwell next door often told others, "They're such a perfect couple, always polite, always together." At barbecues, people noticed how Maria leaned her head on David's shoulder, how he served her food before filling his own plate. They looked like a portrait of modern love, tested, enduring, unshaken. But Maria's smile sometimes lingered a moment too long after jokes from other men, and David's eyes sometimes followed her too closely, as if searching for cracks in the surface he relied on to stay whole. He never voiced his fear, never dared to question the bond he believed was stronger than his broken biology. Still, trust is fragile, and secrets, no matter how carefully managed, create shadows in even the brightest homes. As autumn leaves gathered on the sidewalk outside their house, David felt a quiet contentment watching Maria set a vase of fresh flowers on the dining table. He convinced himself, as he had countless times before, that love was enough. What he did not know, what he could never have predicted, was how quickly that fragile belief would shatter, because soon Maria would share news that would unravel everything they thought they had built. Together, the night Maria chose to tell him was ordinary in every visible way. Dinner plates sat on the table, faint music played from the living room, and the hum of life outside their windows seemed unchanged. Yet in David's chest, time slowed the moment Maria cleared her throat and set down her fork. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them together, her dark eyes shining with a strange mixture of fear and joy. "David," she began softly, "I have something to tell you." Her voice quivered, but not from uncertainty. It carried a quiet intensity that immediately pressed on his nerves. He looked up, fork suspended, waiting. Maria drew a breath, her lips curving into a smile that wavered as tears filled her eyes. "I'm pregnant." The words landed like a blow. For a heartbeat, David thought he had misheard. Pregnant. The word echoed in his skull, tearing through the fragile comfort he had spent years building. His fork clattered onto the plate, the sound far too loud in the stillness of the room. Silence stretched between them. Maria's smile faltered, searching his face for reaction. He wanted to speak, to question, to shout, but his voice betrayed him. Instead, he stared at her, chest tightening, mind racing to the one truth he could not escape. He was infertile. 15 years of test results, of quiet acceptance, of living with that fact. And now this. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "I know it's a surprise," she whispered, "but it's wonderful, isn't it?" David forced his lips into something resembling a smile, though it felt foreign on his face. "Yes," he managed, the words sharp and hollow. He nodded quickly, as if the movement could convince them both. It's incredible, Maria." She exhaled, relief flooding her expression, and squeezed his hand. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but these were tears of joy. "I was so scared to tell you. I didn't know how you'd react." He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Inside, his thoughts spun in chaos. How? How could this be possible? Doctors had been certain. Test after test had confirmed it, unless medicine had lied, or something else had. "David, I've never been happier," Maria continued, her voice breaking with emotion. "This is the miracle we never thought we'd have." Miracle. The word stung. He wanted to believe it, to grasp onto her excitement and let it wash away his doubt. But the weight of reality pressed down harder. The possibility he dared not voice clawed at him. If he could not be the father, then who was? He studied her face as she spoke, her eyes bright, her cheeks flushed with joy. She looked genuine, unguarded, and yet every smile, every tender word now carried a shadow. When she rose to embrace him, David wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. He felt her heartbeat against his chest, quick and full of life, but his own pulse thundered with dread. He whispered into her hair, "I love you," and the words tasted like ash. All through the night, he lay awake beside her. Maria drifted into peaceful sleep, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. David stared at the ceiling, mind unraveling with questions he dared not ask aloud. Was it betrayal? Was it a cruel twist of fate? Or was there some explanation he had not yet imagined? The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap of shadows and unspoken truths. Maria's soft breaths filled the room while David's doubts gnawed at the silence. Morning light would come soon enough, and with it, the need for answers. But for now, he lay in the dark, a storm brewing inside him, knowing that life as he had known it had already ended. The morning after Maria's announcement, David moved through the motions of daily life with mechanical precision. He brewed coffee, ironed his shirt, and kissed her cheek before leaving for work. But beneath the outward routine, his mind was fractured, endlessly replaying the words, "I'm pregnant." At the office, he couldn't concentrate. The glow of his computer screen blurred as numbers and emails melted into static. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Maria's tearful smile, her trembling hands, her whispered excitement. And each time, the same unrelenting question echoed back. If not me, then who? By the time he returned home that evening, his doubts had hardened into vigilance. He studied Maria more carefully than ever before, searching for cracks in her joy. She greeted him warmly, dinner simmering on the stove, but when her phone buzzed on the counter, she snatched it up with unusual speed. "Work," she explained quickly, pressing the phone to her ear as she turned away. David watched the tension in her shoulders, the hushed tone in her voice. Her back to him, she paced slowly, words too faint for him to catch. When she hung up, he asked lightly, "Late calls now?" Maria smiled, though it looked forced. "We're short-staffed. I have to pick up the slack." "Of course," he replied, masking his unease with a nod. But a seed had been planted, and it rooted deeper with each evasive gesture. Over the next week, David kept observing. Maria lingered longer at the office, arriving home with tired smiles and vague excuses. Her phone rarely left her hand, and when she texted, she angled the screen away. At night, she fell asleep quickly, exhaustion draping over her like a blanket, while David lay restless beside her, his mind spiraling. The paranoia grew teeth. He noticed details that might once have slipped by. The faint trace of unfamiliar cologne on her clothes, the way he avoided his gaze when he asked about her day, the nervous laugh that bubbled up when he teased about her secretive phone habits. One evening, unable to hold it in any longer, he asked directly, "Maria, is there something you're not telling me?" Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean?" "You've been different. The calls, the late nights, the secrecy." Maria set her fork down, eyes narrowing. "David, are you accusing me of something?" "I'm just asking for honesty." His voice trembled with a mixture of fear and anger. She leaned back, arms crossing. "I'm pregnant, David. Do you have any idea how much stress I'm under? Work is piling up. My body is changing, and now you're interrogating me like I've done something wrong?" Her words hit with practiced sharpness, cutting off his doubts before they could form into accusations. Guilt washed over him, though it didn't silence the gnawing unease inside. I want to understand," he murmured. Maria's eyes softened, but only slightly. "Then trust me. Please, don't make this harder than it already is." He nodded slowly, retreating into silence, but the mistrust lingered. That night, while Maria slept soundly, David sat in the living room, the glow of the streetlights casting pale patterns across the floor. His thoughts raced in endless loops. Was he imagining things? Or was Maria hiding a truth so devastating it could shatter everything? He thought of her smile when she told him the news, the relief when he forced his own smile in return. Was that the expression of a loving wife, or of someone who had already betrayed him? The seed of doubt had sprouted, twisting its roots through every corner of his mind. By dawn, he knew one thing with certainty: he could no longer take Maria's words at face value. He needed proof, one way or another. David's sleepless night had left him raw, his mind gnawed by suspicion. As he left for work, Maria's soft "see you tonight" echoed like a lie he couldn't unhear. While he trudged through his day, a different story was unfolding elsewhere, one he had no idea existed. Flashbacks seep into Maria's past, painting a picture she carefully hid. Months earlier, when late nights at the office became routine, she had found herself drawn to Daniel, her project supervisor. He was everything David wasn't: confident, charming, the kind of man who filled a room with presence. Maria had first laughed at his jokes in harmless camaraderie, but soon those laughs grew longer, softer, more private. It began innocently: an after-work drink, a lingering touch when he handed her papers, compliments murmured when no one else was around. But temptation thrives in shadows. One rainy evening, as thunder rattled the windows and fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, Maria lingered behind with Daniel to finish a deadline. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside her as he leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "You deserve more than a man who doesn't see you," he whispered. Her defenses crumbled under the weight of longing, for attention, for validation, for escape. That night marked the start of a dangerous entanglement. In stolen moments, Maria felt alive in ways she hadn't for years. Daniel's boldness thrilled her, his words laced with promises that seemed too intoxicating to resist. "With me, you won't have to hide who you are," he would say, brushing strands of hair from her face with deliberate tenderness. She convinced herself it wasn't betrayal. It was discovery, a rediscovery of a self long buried under routine. But Daniel's charm was edged with manipulation. As their intimacy deepened, so too did his control. He reminded her of her husband's limitations, of the child they could never have together. He pressed gently, yet persistently. "Why settle for a marriage tied to emptiness when you could have a future with me?" When Maria discovered she was pregnant, her world split in two. Panic clawed at her chest. David, her husband, knew the truth about his condition. There was no way to reconcile her growing belly with his medical reality. But Daniel had been quick to respond. "You can't tell him," Daniel insisted, his tone firm, almost commanding. "If he knows, it's over for both of us. He'll divorce you, maybe worse. Do you want to raise this child alone?" Maria had protested, her voice trembling. "But I can't keep lying to him." "You have to," Daniel said, gripping her hands tightly. His eyes burned with an intensity that both comforted and frightened her. "If you love me, if you believe in us, you'll protect what we've built. Tell him it's his. He'll never question it." Maria had turned away, tears streaking her cheeks. Somewhere in her, guilt gnawed at her conscience. Yet Daniel's words held power, threading into her fears and binding her silence. He painted a vision of a shared life that seemed fragile yet dazzling, a future where secrets were stepping stones rather than stumbling blocks. In the days that followed, she rehearsed the lie until it felt like truth. When she finally told David she was pregnant, her tears weren't entirely false. They carried fragments of joy, of terror, and of the weight of deception. Daniel's shadow loomed over her smile, unseen but ever present. Meanwhile, David's quiet unraveling intensified. His observations, his probing questions, his restless nights. Maria felt the tension tightening like a noose. Each time his eyes lingered too long, her heart raced with fear that he saw straight through her facade. And still Daniel pushed. "Stay calm. He won't suspect. Just keep playing the role. You're almost free." But Mari wasn't sure what freedom looked like anymore. Every step forward seemed shackled by lies. Every embrace with Daniel felt like a betrayal amplified. And each glance at David's weary face lined with love and confusion reminded her of what she had destroyed. As the dual worlds collided, her husband's mounting suspicion and her lover's unrelenting demands, Maria realized her carefully spun web was fraying. The walls were closing in, and somewhere in the darkness of David's mind, the next stage of discovery was already taking shape. David's doubts had grown into something uncontainable. The echoes of Maria's words, "We're going to have a baby," rattled against the iron bars of his mind. In the silence of their bedroom, her soft breathing beside him felt like a stranger's lullaby. He couldn't live with shadows and half-truths anymore. He needed proof. The next morning, he made an appointment with his urologist, Dr. Miller. As he sat in the sterile waiting room, the antiseptic smell stung his nostrils, his knee bouncing with anxious rhythm. When his name was called, David followed numbly, his palms clammy against the file he carried. Dr. Miller greeted him with professional calm. "It's been a while, David. What brings you back?" David swallowed hard. I need to know if anything's changed. If there's even a chance." His voice cracked. "She's pregnant, Doctor. Maria's pregnant." The words hung heavy between them. Dr. Miller adjusted his glasses, his tone careful. "David, you know your history. We've run multiple tests over the years. Your infertility is permanent. There hasn't been any breakthrough that would alter that. David leaned forward, desperation in his eyes. Run them again, please. I need certainty. A few days later, the results came back, unchanged. 0 motility, 0 chance. As the doctor delivered the confirmation, David felt the last sliver of denial slip away. The truth stood stark before him. The child Maria carried could not be his. He drove home in silence, the city's neon lights blurring against he windshield. Every red light felt like an accusation, every turn a reminder that his marriage was no longer what he believed it to be. But suspicion wasn't enough. He needed evidence. That's when he contacted a private investigator, a man recommended by a discreet colleague. His name was Carter, a middle-aged veteran with a weary face and eyes that had seen too much. They met in a dimly lit diner at the edge of town, where Carter's gravelly voice cut through the clatter of dishes. "You want her followed?" Carter asked, his pen poised over a small notepad. David nodded stiffly. "Yes, discreetly. I need to know where she goes, who she sees. Everything." For a week, David lived in torment. At home, he pretended. He forced smiles, touched Maria's belly with trembling hands, and listened to her speak of nursery colors and baby names. At night, he lay awake, waiting for Carter's updates. The first photographs arrived in a plain envelope slipped under his door. David sat at the kitchen table in the half-light of dawn, his hands trembling as he pulled out the glossy prints. Maria, standing outside a cafe, leaning close to a man with striking features and a confident stance. Daniel. Other photos followed. Maria entering a hotel lobby with him, their shoulders brushing. The two of them in a quiet park, her hand grazing his arm. Stolen moments of intimacy that told a story no husband should ever see. Each image was a knife, carving deeper into David's chest. His world, the dinners, the shared laughter, the vows, collapsed into a montage of betrayal. When Carter called to deliver his verbal report, his tone carried the weight of sympathy. "I'm sorry, David. It's clear they've been seeing each other for some time. This isn't recent." David thanked him mechanically, though his voice was hollow. After hanging up, he sat in the darkness of the living room, staring at the photograph, spread across the coffee table. His heart pounded with grief, rage, and disbelief, all tangled into one unbearable knot. Maria's laughter from the bedroom floated down the hall, mocking in its lightness. David pressed his fists into his temples, tears stinging his eyes. The truth was undeniable now, and with it came the unbearable burden of choice. Would he confront her, or would he let the lie unravel further until it consumed them both? As he rose and gathered the photographs, one thought echoed louder than the rest. This was only the beginning. The photographs lay hidden in the bottom drawer of David's desk, but their images burned into his mind every time he looked at Maria. Each smile she offered seemed counterfeit, each word rehearsed. The weight of silence was suffocating him. That night, as the rain tapped against the windows, David decided he could no longer play the part of the blind husband. He found her in the kitchen, rinsing plates, humming softly to herself. The ordinary domesticity of the scene nearly broke him. But then he remembered the hotel lobby photo, the way her hand had brushed against another man's arm. "Maria," he said, his voice tight. She turned, surprised by the gravity in his tone. "What is it?" His hands gripped the edge of the counter. "I went back to the doctor." Her brow furrowed. "Doctor? What for?" "You know what for." His words were sharp, almost cutting. 15 years, Maria. 15 years of being told I can't father a child. And now suddenly you're pregnant. Tell me how that's possible." The color drained from her face. The dish slipped from her hands into the sink with a dull clatter. For a moment she stood frozen, water dripping from her fingertips. You don't know what you're saying, she whispered. I know exactly what I'm saying, David shot back, his voice rising. I saw you. Don't lie to me anymore. I know there's someone else. Her lips trembled. She turned away, clutching a towel as if it could shield her from the storm gathering, in his words. David, please. Don't please me. He slammed his fist against the counter, the sound reverberating through the kitchen. I gave you my life, my trust, everything. And this is how you repay me? Sneaking around with another man, carrying his child under my roof? Maria's knees buckled, and she sank onto a chair. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. Then why? His voice cracked, breaking through the fury into raw pain. Why him? Why betray me like this? She buried her face in her hands. Because I was lonely, she sobbed. Because I wanted something more than silence and routine. You shut yourself away in your own pain, David. You were here, but you weren't. And I was weak. David's chest heaved, torn between rage and grief. So you gave yourself to another man. Her sobs grew harsher, but she lifted her head to meet his eyes. For the first time, her voice steadied. Yes, I made a mistake. I was unfaithful. The admission sliced through the air like a blade. Silence followed, heavy and unbearable. David staggered back, his hand covering his mouth as if to keep from crying out. His eyes glistened. You admit it, he said hoarsely. Maria nodded slowly, her face streaked with tears. But I won't tell you who he is. His stare hardened. You won't. What? I can't, she said, her voice breaking again. If I tell you, it'll destroy everything. Him, me, this baby. You'll never forgive me. David's fists clenched at his sides. You think I can forgive you now? Maria shook her head, trembling. I don't know. I don't know anything anymore. All I know is that I'm terrified, David. Terrified of losing everything. The room seemed to shrink, filled with the weight of betrayal and despair. David turned away, pacing, his thoughts a hurricane. He wanted her to scream the Ma's name, to make it real, to end the torment of uncertainty. Yet all she offered was silence. Finally he stopped, his back to her. I can't look at you right now, he muttered. Not until I know the truth. Maria rose slowly, her shoulders shaking, and left the kitchen. Her footsteps faded up the stairs, leaving David standing alone in the dim light. The rain outside grew heavier, pounding against the glass like a relentless drum. David stared into the darkness, his heart shattering under the weight of her confession and the unanswered question of who. And deep inside, a dangerous resolve began to form. If Maria would not tell him the truth, he would rip it from the shadows himself. David hardly slept after Maria's confession. Her words, I was unfaithful, looped endlessly in his head, echoing against every corner of his mind. She had admitted it, yet withheld the name. That omission gnawed at him more viciously than the affair itself. Somewhere out there was a man who had stolen his wife, planted a child in her body, and left David to drown in humiliation. The house became unbearable. Maria drifted through rooms like a ghost, her eyes swollen from crying, while David shut himself away in his study. Days blurred. He stopped answering calls, ignored work, and left meals untouched. The walls felt closer each night, suffocating him with silence. When he did step outside, it was only to watch her. He began following Maria discreetly, shadowing her errands with quiet precision. Every stop she made, grocery store, pharmacy, cafe, he watched from a distance, his chest tight with suspicion. He expected to see him, the stranger, the thief of his life, emerge from around a corner. But each time, she returned home alone, her face drawn with exhaustion. The absence of evidence only sharpened his obsession. She's hiding him better now, he told himself. She knows I'm close. At night, he replayed their confrontation in his mind, dissecting every pause, every tear, every refusal to speak the father's name. He heard betrayal even in her silence. He began to keep. The photographs Carter had given him spread across his desk like puzzle pieces, staring at Maria leaning toward Daniel, the subtle intimacy in her body language. The man's face stared back at him in frozen confidence, a smirk David read as arrogance. His hands shook as he traced the edges of the photo. Rage simmered, coiling like a snake in his chest. Conversations with Maria became clipped, mechanical. She tried to bridge the distance, offering apologies, explanations, but he brushed past her, his gaze cold. The pregnancy that once made her glow now filled him with disgust. Every curve of her belly reminded him that he was not the father. The spiral deepened. One night, as Maria slept, David sat in the living room with the lights off, a whiskey glass untouched in his hand. His reflection in the window startled him. The hollow eyes, the clenched jaw, the man unrecognizable from the husband he had been. "You've lost control," he whispered to himself. "And control is everything." The thought grew louder, darker. If he could not reclaim his wife's loyalty, if he could not undo the child growing inside her, then perhaps he could take back control another way. His mind toyed with ideas he had once found unthinkable. Exposure, revenge, even violence. Each possibility sparked both fear and temptation. He followed Maria again 2 days later, keeping his car several lengths behind hers. She pulled into a clinic, her steps cautious. He waited outside, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. After nearly an hour, she emerged, clutching papers to her chest, her face pale. David's heart pounded. Was it routine checkups, or secrets sealed behind medical walls? As she drove away, David whispered into the empty car, "I'll find out, one way or another." By the time they returned home, his decision had solidified. He could no longer remain a passive observer. If Maria would not tell him the truth, he would rip it from the world himself, even if it meant stepping into darkness he could never return from. The man in the photographs had a name, and soon, David vowed, he would have more than that. He would have answers. The decision David made in his car, that he would uncover the truth no matter the cost, quickly became his only focus. He called Carter, the private investigator, demanding more than photographs and speculation. David needed a name, a history, a man to hold accountable for everything Maria had destroyed. Carter didn't disappoint. Days later, he slid a folder across David's desk. "His name is Daniel Ross," Carter said flatly. 35, senior project manager at your wife's company. Divorced 5 years ago. No kids. Reputation for charm. And for leaving a trail. David opened the folder with trembling hands. Photographs, bank records, even restaurant receipts stared back at him. But it was the headshot, Daniel's smirk frozen in casual arrogance, that seared into David's mind. Finally, the faceless threat had a name, an identity. "Daniel," David whispered, almost tasting the word. It felt poisonous on his tongue. The narrative shifted as Carter's findings spilled out in cold detail. Witnesses described Daniel as magnetic, the kind of man who commanded attention in a room without trying. Maria had not stood a chance, David thought bitterly. Through flashbacks pieced together from Carter's notes and Maria's evasive hints, the forbidden love unfolded. It had begun innocently, with late-night projects at the office. Maria, tired of David's long work hours and emotional distance, found comfort in Daniel's attention. He listened. He laughed at her stories. He leaned close when she spoke, as though her words mattered more than anyone else's. For a woman carrying the silent weight of a husband's infertility, his validation was intoxicating. One night, after too many glasses of wine at a corporate dinner, Maria let her guard slip. Daniel walked her to her car, his hand brushing against hers in a way that lingered too long. That small spark became wildfire. Secret lunches turned into whispered phone calls, then hotel rooms where Maria felt both guilty and alive in equal measure. But Daniel was no savior. His affection came laced with manipulation. He told her David would never fulfill her dreams of motherhood, that she deserved more than a loveless marriage built on secrets. He promised her a future, just enough hope to keep her tethered to him. Yet when Maria clung too tightly, when her calls became frequent and her emotions raw, Daniel began to withdraw. "You knew what this was," he once told her, his tone cool, his shirt half-buttoned after their encounter. Maria had cried in silence as he walked out of the hotel room, leaving her with a mix of longing and shame. Now, with her pregnancy undeniable, Daniel's shadow grew heavier. He avoided her more often, his excuses piling up. Maria's tears at home were no longer about guilt toward David, but about Daniel's rejection. David absorbed every word of Carter's report with a mix of rage and revelation. Maria's affair was not just betrayal, it was exploitation. She had been deceived by a man who thrived on power, who saw her vulnerability as opportunity. That realization did not soften David's hatred. If anything, it sharpened it. Late that night, David sat alone at the dining table, Daniel's photograph pinned under his palm. "So this is you," he muttered. "The man who thought he could take my life, my wife, my dignity." His voice shook with fury. "You won't get away with this." Maria, asleep upstairs, stirred restlessly in her dreams. She had no idea her husband now held the key to her secret, that Daniel's name and face had given David's obsession a target. The house felt different the next morning. For the first time in weeks, David moved with purpose. The depression that had kept him chained to his study lifted, replaced by a colder, more dangerous resolve. Daniel was no longer an abstract suspicion. He was real, flesh and blood, walking somewhere under the same sky. David imagined his hands around the man's throat, imagined watching the smirk fade from that confident face. And as he left the house that morning, quietly, without telling Maria, one thought consumed him. It was time to step out of the shadows. Time for Daniel to feel the weight of everything he had set in motion. Daniel's name echoed in David's mind like a curse, repeating with every step, every breath. Now that the shadow had a face, David could no longer sit idle. Rage alone wasn't enough. It demanded action, precision. And so, in the quiet hours of the night, he began to plan. The dining table transformed into his war room. Carter's folder lay open, its contents spread across the polished wood. Photographs of Daniel leaving restaurants, receipts from hotel stays, timestamps that aligned with Maria's lies. David's handwriting scrawled across scraps of paper. Locations, habits, possibilities. He studied Daniel like prey. The plan did not form in one clear piece, but rather in fragments, born from obsession. Some nights it leaned toward humiliation, exposing Daniel's predatory charm to his colleagues, making him suffer socially. Other nights, darker thoughts took over. Thoughts of finality. Thoughts of ensuring Daniel would never ruin another life. Maria remained oblivious to David's quiet plotting. To her, his sudden calm seemed like acceptance. She mistook his silence for surrender, never noticing the dangerous gleam growing in his eyes. But Maria herself was unraveling in ways David didn't need Carter's reports to confirm. One evening, David lingered in the hallway while Maria spoke on the phone. Her voice was sharp, wounded. You don't get to just disappear when it's convenient for you, she whispered harshly. I didn't make this decision alone. You were there, Daniel. You promised. A pause, then Daniel's muffled reply, dismissive, cold. Maria's tone cracked, desperation seeping through. Don't you dare treat me like a mistake. I'm carrying your child, Daniel. Yours. The silence that followed told David everything. Daniel wasn't reassuring her. He was retreating, washing his hands of the very life he had helped create. Maria sobbed quietly after hanging up, clutching her stomach as though holding on to the only anchor left. David, hidden in the shadows, felt a twisted surge of satisfaction. Daniel was slipping away from her, abandoning her just as David had suspected. That crack in their secret relationship gave David confidence, dangerous confidence. If Daniel could betray Maria, then David could destroy him. He justified it in his head as justice, not vengeance. Daniel was a predator, and predators deserved to be hunted. At night, David mapped out scenarios. He practiced the timing of leaving the house without Maria noticing. He rehearsed in his mind the confrontation he would stage, imagining Daniel's arrogance melting into fear. His fantasies blurred the line between possibility and inevitability. By day, he played the role of dutiful husband. He made Maria breakfast, asked about doctor's appointments, even placed a hand on her shoulder when she looked especially fragile. But behind every gesture lingered calculation. The more Maria leaned on him for comfort, the more certain David became that she had nowhere else to turn. And when she finally broke, when she admitted Daniel's abandonment, David would be ready with his own brand of truth. Late one night, David sat in the darkened study, Daniel's photograph lit, only by a desk lamp. His fingers traced the edges of the picture, his whisper barely audible. You think you've won, but you don't even see me coming. The words chilled even him, yet he didn't stop. He imagined Daniel's every move, rehearsed his downfall until it felt inevitable. David's world had narrowed to a single outcome: confrontation. The darkness around him pressed in, heavy and suffocating. He no longer questioned if he was drifting too far into madness. He embraced it. To reclaim control, to punish betrayal, to make Daniel pay, he would do whatever it took. And as the clock struck midnight, David finally closed the folder, his plan sharpening into something more tangible. He would not wait much longer. The storm he carried inside was ready to break. The night David had rehearsed endlessly arrived not with a plan, but with a surge of rage too heavy to contain. The storm inside him finally broke. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, breath shallow, eyes fixed on the building Carter had once photographed. Daniel's favorite escape, a quiet apartment rented under another name. David had waited for confirmation that Maria still met him there, and now, as the lights flickered behind curtained windows, his certainty solidified into action. He stepped out of the car, the winter air biting at his skin. Every sound, the crunch of gravel, the hum of a distant streetlight, seemed magnified. In his pocket, his fingers closed around the small kitchen knife he had taken earlier, its weight both terrifying and strangely comforting. Inside, Maria and Daniel sat across from each other, the tension between them already thick. Daniel's charm had withered. He leaned back in his chair, face cold with detachment. Maria's voice trembled as she pleaded. You can't leave me like this. I gave up everything for you. Do you hear me? Everything. Daniel's jaw tightened. It was never supposed to go this far, Maria. You knew that. I told you from the start. No strings, no promises. Tiempo. Maria's tears fell freely. Desperation clings to every syllable. I'm carrying your child. How can you... Her words stopped as the door burst open with a violent crack. David stormed inside, chest heaving, eyes wild. Maria gasped, rising to her feet while Daniel instinctively shoved back his chair, anger flashing across his face. David! Maria's voice broke. But David's focus had narrowed to Daniel, the man who had stolen his wife, his trust, and his life's meaning. You think you can take everything from me and just walk away? David's voice was low, shaking with fury. Daniel smirked, masking unease with bravado. This is between Maria and me. You don't belong here. That was the final spark. David lunged. The knife flashed under the dim light, clashing with Daniel's raised arm as the two men crashed into the table. Papers scattered, a glass shattered on the floor. Maria screamed, trying to pull them apart, but the frenzy was unstoppable. Daniel fought hard, his fists striking David's ribs, but rage lent David a strength beyond reason. The blade pierced flesh once, then again. Daniel's cry of pain turned guttural, choked with disbelief. His body staggered backward, crashing into the wall before sliding down, a crimson trail marking his fall. The room filled with the metallic stench of blood. Maria froze, trembling, staring at Daniel's lifeless body sprawled across the floor. David stood above him, chest heaving, knife dripping red. For a moment, silence suffocated the room. Then Maria screamed. Her hands clawed at David's arm, shoving him away. "What have you done?" she cried, voice raw with horror. David turned, and in his frenzy, his arm lashed out. The knife grazed Maria's side, slicing through skin. She collapsed to the floor, clutching her stomach, her breaths sharp with pain. Blood seeped through her dress, staining the fabric dark. David froze, eyes wide, realization crashing in. This wasn't justice. This wasn't control. He had destroyed everything, Daniel, Maria, himself. Maria. His voice was a whisper now, broken. He dropped the knife, its clatter echoing in the suffocating silence. He knelt beside her, his hands hovering uselessly over her wound. I didn't mean... Her eyes met his, filled with fear and betrayal. You've ruined everything, she rasped, tears streaking her cheeks. The neighbors had already heard the screams, the violent crash of furniture, the muffled cries. Feet hurried up the stairwell, and then came the frantic pounding on the door. Voices shouted. Someone called for the police. David sat paralyzed, his body trembling, his eyes flicking between Maria's bleeding form and Daniel's still body. The sound of sirens grew closer, slicing through the night. Maria groaned, clutching her wound, and the reality of what came next pressed down like a crushing weight. David's plan, his careful fantasies of control, had collapsed into chaos. There was no redemption, no reclaiming what was lost, only the truth written in blood across the floor. The door burst open, officers flooding in. Their flashlights cut through the dimness, illuminating the horror. Shouts filled the apartment, commands to drop to the ground, calls for medics, gasps as they registered the carnage before them. David raised his hands slowly, tears streaking his face, the weight of his choices dragging him down. Behind him, Maria whimpered as paramedics rushed to her side. Beside them lay Daniel, silent, lifeless, and beyond saving. The officers pulled David to the ground, cuffs biting into his wrists. As they dragged him up, his gaze lingered on Maria. Her face blurred with pain, but her eyes still burned with a hatred he would never escape. And just as he was led outside, the flashing red and blue lights washing over him, David realized his storm had found its end. Not in victory, but in ruin. The courtroom buzzed with subdued whispers, a collective hum of curiosity and judgment that seemed to weigh heavily on the air. David sat at the defense table, his suit, ill-fitted, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights in a holding cell. The memory of blood on his hands had never left him. He kept his head bowed, his cuffed wrists hidden beneath the table, as if trying to disappear into the wood grain. Across the room, Maria sat pale and trembling, her wound healed into a scar that she would never stop feeling. Every time her eyes met David's, they flickered with a complex storm of fear, anger, and something softer, guilt that refused to let her go. The judge entered, stern and unyielding, and the trial began. The prosecution wasted no time. Their voice rang out clear and sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a man who chose rage over reason. A man who, confronted with betrayal, did not seek help or understanding, but instead armed himself and took a life. This was not an accident. This was murder." They painted David as a cold-blooded killer, a man who had plotted revenge with precision before striking. Photographs of the bloodied crime scene were projected onto the screen. Daniel's lifeless body slumped against the wall, the knife glinting under harsh light, Maria clutching her side in agony. The jury flinched, and even the officers guarding the door shifted uncomfortably. The defense countered with equal fire. David's attorney, a man with graying temples and a tired yet steady voice, leaned into the human tragedy. "David is not a monster," he argued. "He is a man who has lived with infertility for 15 years. A man who believed his wife's loyalty was unshakable, only to discover her affair with a co-worker who manipulated her and abandoned her. David was driven to the breaking point. This was not cold-blooded murder. It was the collapse of a human heart under unbearable betrayal." "Assomni." The jury watched, torn between the cold clarity of evidence and the messy depths of human pain. When Maria was called to testify, the courtroom held its breath. She walked slowly to the stand, her hands trembling as she adjusted the microphone. Her voice was soft, cracking at the edges. "I never wanted it to come to this," she began, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. I was lonely and I let myself believe in someone who promised me things David couldn't give. I betrayed my husband, and I destroyed the family we had built. But I never imagined it would end like this." The prosecutor guided her through the night of the murder. Maria recounted the moment the door burst open, David's eyes filled with rage, the knife flashing in the dim light. Her tears fell freely as she described Daniel's collapse, the sound of his last breath, the pain of her own wound. When asked if she believed David intended to kill, Maria hesitated. Her lips trembled. I think he lost himself. I don't know if he meant to kill, but he meant to hurt, and it destroyed everything." The defense pressed her differently, leaning into the cracks of guilt. "Maria, do you believe your betrayal pushed David into a state of torment?" Her silence stretched, the weight of the question crushing her chest. Finally she whispered, "Yes, I believe I broke him." The room shivered with that admission, but it wasn't enough to undo the damage. Closing arguments brought the tragedy into sharp relief. The prosecution demanded accountability, insisting that no betrayal could excuse murder. The defense begged for mercy, asking the jury to see David as a shattered man, not a predator. Hours passed as the jury deliberated. David sat motionless, staring at the table, while Maria wrung her hands in the gallery. When the verdict finally came, the silence was absolute. "We, the jury, find the defendant, David Miller, guilty of second-degree murder." The words struck like a gavel to the heart. David exhaled shakily, almost relieved that the torment had reached its conclusion. Maria covered her face, sobbing quietly, her tears a mixture of grief for Daniel, for David, and for herself. The judge sentenced David to 20 years in prison. Justice was delivered, yet the cost felt unbearable. Daniel was gone, Maria was shattered, and David's life was reduced to shadows behind bars. As he was led away, David glanced once more at Maria. Their eyes met across the courtroom, a silent acknowledgement of love betrayed, truth revealed, and lives destroyed. The cost of truth was everything,